Hello, this is another of our Oral History Project interviews for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. I'm Cliff Brockman of Wartburg College, along with Paul Yeager of Iowa PBS. And today we're talking with Andrea Zinga, a person whose face should be very familiar to those who live in the Quad Cities. Hi, Andrea. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Cliff. Thank you.
Andrea, let's kind of start at the beginning here. How did you get interested in broadcast journalism?
I was about 13 and I was watching TV. And when you're that age, you're always trying to figure out what you want to be. And I suddenly had probably the only eureka moment of my whole life. I said, oh, that's it. Communications. It's as old as the first two people who ever, communicated with each other, and as new as what happened 5 minutes ago. So I was hooked, and from then on, that was my goal.
And where did you go after that? You went to college somewhere.
Oh, I did the usual things. I worked when I was 16, and I worked at a radio station in town 5 different times. My general manager there said, I hired you more than anybody else ever. But it was because I was going to college, and then I would come back for the summer, and the routine when you're that age.
Yes, and so then after that, you headed off, and was it WQAD then after that?
That was my first TV job, yes, and I was very, very excited about it. I had been in radio, and when I went in and finally got my interview with the general manager, he was an engineer. And he said, what do you want to do here? I said, well, I want to give the news. And he said, I cannot believe, Cliff, that my life spans this kind of an era. But he said, nobody wants to hear a woman give the news. So I said, well, okay. And so I started as a file clerk, and then I started to write commercials, and then I started to voice commercials, and I would sit, and then I got myself some interviews at the 4-H and Junior show because nobody else wanted to do them, and I knew nothing. I was a city girl, so I had the farmers at home just rolling in the aisles over these interviews. And so from there, I got my own talk show in which I booked the guests, hosted, produced, ran the board, and did the FEC readings every so often. No, not FEC. What am I thinking of?
FCC.
FCC, that's it. FEC was another chapter. But anyway, so that was interesting, and that was good training. And I would sit there in my off time and look at the on the air sign on the wall, and I would read to it. And that's how I was able eventually to get into TV at WQAD. So exciting.
Yeah. So then were you an anchor right away, or did you?
No. I came up through the ranks like so many people do. I started as a reporter, and during the tenure, I did various things. I was the consumer reporter. I was, that I think was my primary thing there, consumer reporting, and I might have anchored at WQ, yes, I did. At the end, I anchored there too, yes, with Jim King.
Oh, yes, right. Jim King, a legend in the Quad Cities.
Yes. Jim, one day on the air, we had just read a story about Marilyn Monroe's underwear being auctioned for a certain amount, thousands and thousands of dollars. And Jim, being Jim, turned to me, absolutely deadpan, and said, what would you take for your underwear? Now, he could not have got away with that comment today, right? I mean, he would have been immediately hauled into the office, if not worse. But in those days, it was kind of like Mad Men. So, yeah, I recall that I had no rejoinder whatsoever. I was just shocked.
Well, at one point, you went off to CNN and left the Quad Cities. How did that come about?
I went down to Atlanta, and I went to CNN, and I got an audition. I don't remember exactly how it happened. I do remember that my mother and I went to CNN to tour. And one of the things you could do was you could sit down and pretend you were giving the news, and then they'd give you the little tape, and then you'd take it home, and that was cool. So I sat down and pretended I was giving the news, and the guy behind the camera said, you've done this before. And I said, yes. And so somehow I got an audition, and it was very interesting. The audition involved reading, of course, so I read. And then the news director said, all right, there's been a plane crash at the local airport. Go. And he wanted to see exactly how well I could ad-lib. Well, there were things at WQAD, for instance, where we had an ice storm and we wound up with a generator and we were broadcasting out of the hallway. So I think your experience in local news is a huge help because you get the opportunity to have to wing it sometimes. And that really, really helped me in the most important 15 minutes of my broadcast life, which was, of course, the Olympic Park bombing.
So then eventually ended up in Texas at a station there, and then I remember you came back to the Quad Cities to WHBF. I was the news director at that point and had some input.
That's why I'm doing this interview, Cliff. I owe you.
Okay. And you began anchoring at WHBF.
Yes.
Tell us about that, your time there. And you can talk about how great the news director was.
Oh, yes, right. My time there was interesting. I worked with Ed Hyland, who was from Florida, I believe. And I remember when Max Collins wrote Road to Perdition and then they did the movie. I've never understood why that movie didn't do better. And Tom Hanks himself, I think, has said he thinks it'll be a cult classic someday. But anyway, Tom Hanks was in it, and Paul Newman was in it, and Jude Law was in it. So anyway, I'm getting to the point that Channel 4, because Max Collins was from Rock Island, we had this big premiere kind of thing, and Ed and I had to dress like the 20s for hosting it. So I remember I went on the news with a Marcel wave in my hair and felt very silly, but there wasn't much else I could do because we were going straight over. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Had a good time, and of course the news director was tremendous.
Yeah.
We had, always through my career, I had interesting series. It was kind of funny. At one of the stations, which I won't mention, and one of the producers, who I will not mention by name, he was probably about 50. And so he assigned me to a series on middle-aged men in crisis.
Oh my.
And I always thought that was a pretty weird topic. But I kind of think he wanted to know more about it. So I did a lot of very varied series. I did one when cholesterol was sort of a new thing that people had not heard much about. And I'm really dating myself here, but oh well, I'm sure you can look at me and tell I'm somewhat older. But we did this series on cholesterol. That was at KWQC. And we sent 11,000 people to the hospital to have their cholesterol checked. And I'm sure we saved some lives. So that was pretty cool. Down in Texas, I was assigned to do a series on what it's like to be blind. And I have to give you credit, Cliff. You never came up with those really, really weird story ideas.
Some of those do sound pretty interesting.
Well, you know, my now husband, who is a videographer, was working in Texas too. He was the chief photographer. And we did it together, and I don't know how easy it would have been otherwise. There are advantages to marrying a videographer, by the way, as per this beautiful setup here.
Yes, and I mentioned that on your end, it's Chuck McClurg, who's a longtime friend, former colleague of mine, who's helping us out there with the camera. And on my end, it's my wife, Cindy Brockman. So we've just got a real kind of family affair going here today.
Thank you, Cindy.
You've had a lot of anecdotes there you've told us about. Any really big stories that stand out to you from your time covering the news?
Well, of course, I was at CNN. I was on the overnight shift anchoring, and I was on a break because it was a really rough shift. You went in at 9, you got hair and makeup. At 10 o'clock, you went over scripts. At 11 o'clock, you went on the air. And you were on the air for a newscast or two, I can't remember. Then you would do some recorded news briefs, and then there was nothing from about 1:30 in the morning till 5 in the morning when you would do the morning newscast. So it was a really hard shift because it was very hard to keep yourself alert for that long. But I was on a break. I was on the phone. And all of a sudden, the beeper at my waist, anybody remember beepers? It went off, and I thought, well, that's odd, because it was about, I don't know, about 1:15, 1:20 a.m. And before I could even hang up, as in gotta go by, I had 2 production assistants who came tearing into the room, and they grabbed me by the arms, and they said, you've got to get to the set. Something's happened. Now, this was the middle of the 1994 Summer Olympics in Atlanta. And Centennial Olympic Park was across the street from the CNN towers. So we knew the whole area and everything about it very well, thank goodness, because something had exploded. And this is what I was told. Something has exploded in the park. Now, as we all know now, it was a bomb, which was set, as they eventually determined, by Eric Rudolph. But we didn't know that then. It had just happened. And so I'm being told something's exploded. You can't say what it is. We don't know what it is. I'm being dragged to the set. Okay, I'm coming. And I kept saying, well, what do we know about this? Now, I have robotic cameras in a very dark studio. I have one video journalist who was kind of a friend of mine by then because we always worked the same shifts. And I said, Greg, what's going on? He said, I don't know, something exploded in the park. I had no scripts. So Greg says to me and to the world, we're going to simulcast with CNN International. So here I am, now I'm going to tell something to the world, to the whole world. And as you can imagine, because it was the Olympics, the whole world was very interested. So about 20 seconds to air, I'm getting nothing in my ear, nothing at all. And I finally pounded on the desk, which for me was kind of like going, ooh. And I said, what's going on? And the producer came on in my ear and she said, oh, I'm so sorry, Andrea, I forgot about you. I was talking to the vice president for news, and we were trying to, figure this all out and what we were going to do. So she said, something exploded. Don't say it was a bomb. Okay, go. So for 2 hours, we just sat there and ad-libbed. Now, fortunately, as this was all happening, I'm hearing running feet. I'm hearing the building filling up with people. It was just so weird in the middle of the night. And fortunately, we had a lot of producers who either had been in the park for some reason or other, or leaped out of bed and went to the park. So I was able to just say the basics of what we knew, and then go to people live, and then eventually we got interviews from people who had seen the guy, or they had seen, I think we all remember that picture of Janet Evans, the swimmer. She was in the park at that time and she heard it, but there were like 1,200 people in the park. And so it, of course, had to be evacuated immediately. And then my then colleague was Judy Woodruff. She got herself out of bed and came in about 2 hours and 15 minutes after we started. And she got to say it was a bomb, which was very upsetting to me because when you're a news person, you want to break what happened. But I did get my name in a couple of national newspapers, usually misspelled, as the person who broke the story. And my news director at CNN was so kind. we actually all got national Emmys for that. And so that, of course, was my biggest story. But I felt like I owed it to the stations like WQAD and KWQC and WHBF because of their style of news coverage. Local news is really, really very immediate. There's so much live work with local news, and I don't mean just on the set, I mean people who are out in the field. So it was all great training. From the day I read the news to that on the air sign on the wall.
That's quite a story.
It is.
Let's take a turn here now. You went from broadcast journalism and ran for Congress. Tell us about that.
You have a couple of hours?
Well, probably not a couple hours, but we have a couple minutes.
Well, I would say that my best advice, and the first advice I ever got, I ignored. And that was a mistake, because I was told you have to know your numbers, and if you're running in a district that does not vote the way you are running, then you might as well save your effort. But I was under the impression that I was well known and people would feel that I could handle the job. And so I ran actually twice. There was a Quincy anchor who ran 3 times. And I had a conversation with him and he said, sometimes I just can't believe I did that. And that's sort of my feeling now. I can't believe I did it. It seems like another person in another world. But I'll tell you 2 things about it. Number one, it was probably the hardest thing I ever did, because the way the district was drawn at that time, they're supposed to be 2 hours contiguous from side to side, north to south and east to west. This district was 5.5 hours from north to south, so that we were down in Carroll County in southern Illinois. I'm sorry, Calhoun County. We were down in Calhoun County trying to campaign, and the district ran through a part of Springfield over to Decatur. It was looking for blue votes is what it was doing. So it was just incredibly hard, this campaign. Nobody understands it. So my second point is, I think we should have a draft in this country, and it should be a political draft. And I think every single citizen should spend at least 1 campaign or 2 doing something, because the insight you get and the experience you get and the understanding about what it's like to do this, let alone serve, I'm just talking run, I really think we would have a more informed electorate that way. I mean, people don't have to run, but they can put flyers together or make phone calls or host something. There are a lot of ways to get involved in politics.
What was 1 or 2 of the major issues when you ran?
Major issues. Well, it was to a degree the same issues that are always major, and that's the economy. I don't think security was just beginning to be an issue. And there was this big flap about me wanting to red flag anybody at an airport who alerted security's interest. And for some reason, this was depicted as me being against people. And it was amazing. I mean, it was amazing how the media did even then take sides, and it was very interesting to see that. But that brings me to the media today, which I feel is totally different. I think that it's because the lines have blurred between news and entertainment, I want to say. So you don't, like when you watch the news now, you don't see, now I'm talking local news, you don't see city council meetings, you don't see school boards, unless it's full house and people are upset enough about something to shout. Then you'll see it. But it's almost more like it's got to be entertainment. And I watch local news in Chicago, near where we live now, and I think, how is this enlightening me in any way? 6 people were killed on the interstate and 14 people were shot in Chicago over the weekend. It does not seem to matter, a lot of it. And that bothers me, and also the fact that news now is so often opinion.
I was just going to ask you about that. That's one of the things I get from a lot of people too, is that there's so much opinion in the news, not reported in an objective or fair manner. And you just mentioned that, so apparently you must feel that way as well. Would you say that's different on the local level than the national level?
Yes, to a degree, but I still see it. It's not as pronounced. Now, having run as a conservative for Congress, I was one, even back then, I was introduced by a state rep as having worked for the Communist News Network, CNN. But I'm telling you, Cliff, in those days when I worked there, I was never, ever, ever asked my politics. I know that the vice president for news had worked in the Lyndon Johnson administration, but I was never asked my politics. We were never asked to color anything or lean anything in any direction. It was absolute objectivity. There were 26 languages spoken there at CNN, and there was certainly a diversity of opinion, but it just didn't make it into the news. In fact, my training in news, and probably yours, Cliff, was total objectivity, to the point that I once had a viewer call in, I think when I was at one of the stations locally, and he said, I pride myself on being able to tell an anchor's politics, but I just can't tell with Andrea Zinga. Well, the fact was, I had to give some time after having been in TV and deciding to run for office to be sure I knew which side I came down on. And that sounds a little strange, but I just always tried to get both sides. So when I see now, now I suppose I would have to work for Fox. But even Fox is biased. And we know that. I'm not saying anything that isn't true. But even to the conservative viewer, Fox is wildly biased. So I used to think NPR was a good source. But NPR now seems to be getting really, really, really opinionated, too, even though they still do great journalism. So nowadays, you almost have to pick your sources. And that's not good, because then you're just reinforcing your own beliefs.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you just kind of a deep think type of question here. We're getting a few newspapers are dying. Every day there's another one. I mean, hardly anybody is reading. I think it's the latest Pew Research was 25% of the people get their news from the newspaper. About 50% get them from television. And a lot of it, people say they get their news from social media. You have any idea, or any thoughts, I should say, not idea, but any thoughts about where this is going, where news coverage is, where people are going to be getting their news from?
A couple of thoughts. One is that newspapers, when you really think about it, have been biased themselves. And again, I think the more local the coverage, the less that happens, the less that can be afforded, because you have to cover what's happening in your town, your community, your area, your county. That said, when you look back at newspapers from the Revolutionary era, they were wildly biased. And I think most people could tell you which of the major newspapers in this country lean which way. So I'm not sure that in itself is a horrible thing. People are going to get their news where it's the most convenient. But where people get it in the future, I think local news probably is going to be safe for a while, especially with the demise of local newspapers, because if people want to know what's happening locally, they have to look at the local news. But as far as in the future, it'll be whatever's the most convenient source.
Well, speaking of the future, what does the future hold for you?
Well, I'm retired, obviously. I'm not totally retired because I have investment properties, and those require a lot of work. I've always kind of hands-on managed them. But the long-term rentals are getting very tiring after a number of years, and so we're switching our business model to short-term rentals where people want to go. So we'll see how that works out, because that just developed in the last year. I have discovered several things. I've discovered the Artists and Writers Institute, AWI, which is really cool. They have a lot of courses and things. And, you know, when you have certain skills or talents, when you reach retirement age, you don't necessarily want to give those up. So I'm being asked to write a book on becoming a TV anchor. And I don't know who wants to read it, but it's fun to write. As far as the future, I hope travel. Here's the thing, Cliff, I'm still waiting to make my mark on the world in a way that will be remembered. So I'm still working at that.
That was going to be my next question. What do you want your legacy to be? How do you want people to remember you?
I want people to say, boy, they broke the mold with her, didn't they? Which is not really true. You know, we all think we're the most unique creature in the world. Well, ideally, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say somebody will pick up one of my screenplays, or I'll write a book that is popular or something. But actually, reasonably, what I would expect, what I would hope, is people would say, well, she was fair, and she was mostly kind, and she was funny sometimes, and she was a good person. I guess that's the best we can all hope for.
Yep, I think you're right. Well, Andrea, I think we'll end it there. It's been fun talking with you. Thanks so much for taking this time to visit with us.
Thank you, Cliff, and Paul, and Cindy, and Chuck.
Very good. This has been an interview with Andrea Zinga, best known for her work perhaps in the Quad Cities for the Oral History Project of the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. Again, I'm Cliff Brockman with producer Paul Yeager. Special thanks to Chuck McClurg and to Cindy Brockman. And thank you for watching.